In Matthew chapter 25 verses 24 and 25 it says, "But when he also who had received a talent came, he said, Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter. And when I was afraid, I hid your talent in the earth. Here is what is yours." This parable also gets to the heart of what is significant for the apostle. The text, as we know it in Matthew, begins with the introductory phrase, "The kingdom of heaven is like." Therefore, we can assume, even if they are not talking about material goods here, what is meant by a talent is knowledge and the opportunity to multiply and grow God's message, His kingdom. The capital that denotes the weight of the talents gives faith in God and His work. Each of the servants receives this capital according to his ability, and 2 servants fulfill their master's command. Faith is an entrusted asset, a gift. This gift is also distributed differently. However, if we consider the value that Jesus brings to the conversation here, then even 1 talent is a huge amount. At that time, a talent of silver was worth 6,000 denarii, or 6,000 days' wages. Now, the man who leaves the country requires something of his servants. The idea of the parable told by Matthew is that they increase his wealth while he is away. So he has actually entrusted them with an enormous amount of capital, his wealth. Of course, he will demand accountability when he returns. This is important when we consider our parable, because Jesus and with him Matthew have in mind the final encounter between man and God, which will require accountability in this encounter. Our parable traces an arc of tension, the goods entrusted to us, the behavior of the servants, and accountability. Each person is entrusted with goods according to their abilities, and it is clear that these are different for each person. There is something else to note that is easy to overlook. In the book of Deuteronomy chapter 23 verses 10 to 21 there is an absolute ban on interest. In our parable, however, Jesus ignores this prohibition when the master accuses his 3rd servant of having put his money in the bank to earn interest. Similarly, the machinations of this master who gives his wealth to the servants don't seem to be entirely in order, because the 3rd servant says, "You reap where you have not sown and gather where you have not scattered." It can therefore be assumed that Jesus is exaggerating here in the story. Why does he do this? Jesus makes it clear, just as businessmen use everything they can to increase their wealth, those called by God should be equally clever to use everything to achieve the kingdom of God, that's profit. The enormous scale of God's gift should be matched by the commitment of the person to whom the gift has been entrusted. The 3rd servant does not comply with his master's wishes. He breaks with him. By burying his talent, he loses everything. Losing faith. The French writer Georges Bernanos, in his book Diary of a Village Priest, creates a dialogue in which the main character says, "No, I haven't lost my faith." The expression of losing faith, like losing your wallet or your keys, has always seemed a bit silly to me. You don't lose your faith, but it stops shaping your life. When faith stops shaping life, then that is exactly the attitude of the 3rd servant. He no longer shapes his life on the basis of his relationship with his master. But what happens when the gift of faith evaporates due to indifference, when everything else in life seems more important and God is lost sight of? If faith and life develop in this way, then the message of the kingdom of God, then faith can no longer shape life, and the prospect of the promised kingdom of God disappears. As a Christian, as a person who has been entrusted with the gift of faith, and, as Jesus says in the parable, this is given to each person in great measure, according to their abilities. The gift of faith means a relationship with God in life. The relationship is the space given to God in our lives. A loving heart, formed by faith, opens up time for God to speak. Jesus makes it clear to us in this parable. And I agree with Bernanos, the gift of faith is not lost like a wallet or a bunch of keys. It is within the heart, but often buried because of a lack of wisdom. We neglect this inner talent, and this deprives us of abundant life. Imagine this servant, he had resources and he buried them. How many have faith buried in their hearts, which could express itself in full life, because the righteous live by faith at all times? Galatians chapter 5, verse 25 says, "If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit." There is no doubt about it, our world is in crisis. Nature is defending itself with ever greater intensity against everything we humans have subjected it to for decades. All this seems threatening and deeply disturbs us. This begs the question, what's left? What can we rely on? We can retreat or return to a foundation that will not crumble. A foundation from which we can look behind the scenes and so that God's messages in all disturbing events can be seen and experienced by us. Paul outlines an ethic, that is, a doctrine of the well-being of the spirit. In short, memorable thoughts, he outlines what is important in the life of a Christian, what behavior results from the Spirit of God, from the law of Christ, regardless of the socio-political, cultural context in which we move. Paul leaves no doubt that it is the Christian's absolute task to lead his life from and in the Spirit of God. Paul describes the Spirit of God in 4 ways. The Spirit of freedom. For Paul, the development of ethical principles from the Spirit of God is a dynamic process that must always be started anew. In doing so, Paul is reacting to the rigid way he dealt with the commandments and the resulting rigid power structures in his day. They showed little of the Spirit of God, but much of the perseverance of the ruling classes. Like Saul himself, Paul was trapped in these power structures and acted as a ruthless defender of legalism. He was also a kind of moral policeman and moral guardian. These guardians are still wreaking havoc today. However, the ethics of the Spirit should not serve to exercise political, economic, or religious power. On the contrary, it arises in the living encounter between the Spirit of God and people in the here and now. This is why there can and should be no irrefutable dogmas, especially those that claim to be able to determine, direct, and control the interpersonal area. The spirit of reconciliation. Anyone dealing with ethical issues will have to deal with their neighbors, near and far, in 2 ways. On the one hand, we are directed by the Spirit of God to the neighbor who shares life with us. Paul urges Christians to pay special attention to themselves when dealing with the transgressions of others. Be careful not to fall. Let's remember that we ourselves are what we are by God's grace. We are subject to sin, in need of forgiveness and always in danger of backsliding. This is why a willingness to forgive and reconcile is necessary, exactly what God has given to all people through Jesus Christ, without any conditions. However, a reconciliatory approach towards those who, as Paul writes, have fallen under sin, is neither natural nor easy. Reconciliation does not mean retrospectively justifying injustice or allowing oneself to be dragged down to the level of the offender. The spirit of solidarity. Bear one another's burdens and you will fulfill the law of Christ. Paul emphasizes, daily life together can only be successful if we, as human beings, become bearers of one another's burdens. This solidarity must be the flagship of Christian communities and must continually radiate out into society. It is undeniable, churches have often failed to live up to this statement. However, the secular world depends more than ever on the inalienable values, the Spirit of God, the law of Christ, that everyone should bear one another's burdens. Here everyone can make their own contribution. The spirit of credibility. Make no mistake, God does not allow himself to be mocked. Do we believe that? It doesn't matter how we treat each other, how we treat creation, with what spirit we live, how we see people. Every day we are presented with the calculation, both positive and negative, of what we did or failed to do yesterday, whether we lived in God's Spirit yesterday or simply revolved around ourselves. Of course, there is no guarantee that good seeds will be followed by a good harvest. Of course, growth and development are influenced by factors outside our respective areas of responsibility. However, we mustn't close our eyes to the fact that many of the distortions that concern us so much today are the harvest of the wrong seeds. Lord, may we live and walk every day in spirit and truth. May we use the gift of faith that you have given us, and may it not remain buried.